The room feels alive before anyone notices why. A reel spins softly, the red light glows, and in the stillness of a recording studio in 1964, something invisible is already wrong. A 6-year-old boy lifts his hand, his eyes narrowing, his instincts screaming, "This sound is broken." The engineers don't see it yet. The producers don't hear it. The adults, seasoned by years of experience, are focused on meters, cables, and routine. And then, from the smallest voice in the room, everything stops. This is the moment the world almost missed. This is the moment Michael Jackson proved that true listening has nothing to do with age. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. The studio itself feels like a cathedral of sound. Thick walls swallow echoes. Dust floats in the warm light above the mixing console. To most people, it's intimidating. To a child, it should be overwhelming. But young Michael Jackson doesn't look afraid. He looks focused, almost burdened, as if he's carrying something no one else can hear. He's been told to stand still, to be quiet, to wait for the adults to do their jobs. This is Motown-era America, where precision is king and hierarchy is law. Engineers trust machines more than instincts. Producers trust experience over intuition. A 6-year-old child is supposed to sing when told, smile when told, and stop talking when told. The tape rolls. The music begins. And something inside Michael tightens. It's subtle, so subtle that even professionals miss it. The rhythm is technically correct. The notes are in tune. The mix looks clean on paper. But there's a fracture hiding beneath the surface, like a hairline crack in glass. The sound breathes wrong. The pocket collapses just enough to steal the soul from the performance. Michael hears it instantly. Not as a technical error, but as a feeling, a wrongness, a tension that shouldn't be there. He looks at the speakers, then at the glass window separating the booth from the control room. His small hand lifts, pointing not at a person, but at the sound itself. "Stop," he says. The room freezes. The tape continues spinning for half a second before an engineer slams the button. Silence crashes down, thick and uncomfortable. Eyes turn, some amused, some annoyed. One producer exhales sharply, already preparing a lecture. Michael has broken the unspoken rule. Children do not interrupt sessions. "What is it?" someone asks, not kindly. Michael hesitates, not because he's unsure, but because translating what he hears into adult language feels impossible. He doesn't know the words phase cancellation or frequency masking. He only knows what his body tells him. It's wrong," he says. "The sound is fighting itself." A pause, then laughter, gentle at first, patronizing. An engineer leans back, confident. "Everything's fine, kid. We've done this 1,000 times." Michael doesn't argue. He listens again, even in silence. He closes his eyes. "The claps," he says quietly. "They're late just a little, and the bass, it's stepping on the voice." Now the laughter fades. Because one engineer, just one, frowns. They rewind the tape. They solo the tracks. They listen again, not casually but carefully. And that's when they hear it. The claps aren't late enough to show on the meters, but they drift just enough to pull the groove backward. The bass, recorded through a slightly misaligned channel, is bleeding into the vocal range, flattening the emotion. It's not loud. It's not obvious, but it's killing the performance. A flaw hidden in plain sound. 5 minutes earlier, this session was routine. Now it's a revelation. The engineer swallows hard. "How did you hear that?" Michael shrugs. "I just listen." That answer rewrites the room. Because in that moment, Michael Jackson isn't a child interrupting adults. He's a musician correcting reality. He's hearing not what the machines report, but what the music feels like when it's alive. They fix the issue. They re-record the take. The difference is instant. The groove locks, the vocal breathes, the song finally moves the way it was meant to. No one speaks when the playback ends. They don't need to. Something fundamental has shifted. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was proof that genius doesn't announce itself with credentials. It announces itself with clarity. From that day on, people listened differently when Michael Jackson spoke. Not because he demanded respect, but because he earned it with his ears. And this moment didn't just save a recording session. It quietly challenged an entire industry. For decades, studios had believed that technology was the final authority, that meters didn't lie, that experience trumped intuition. But a 6-year-old boy exposed the weakness in that logic. He proved that sound is not just physics, it's emotion, timing, and truth. Listening, real listening, is an art. As Michael Jackson grew older, this instinct never left him. Producers would later describe sessions where he'd stop a full orchestra to correct a single breath. Engineers would recall him identifying microscopic distortions that machines barely registered. Dancers would say he heard rhythm where others felt only silence. It all traces back to this room, this tape, this moment when a child refused to ignore what his soul detected. In 1964, Michael was told to be silent. Instead, he taught the world how to hear. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside this story. That greatness often whispers before it roars. That the most important truths are sometimes noticed by those we're least prepared to trust. Because genius doesn't always come with authority. Sometimes it comes with a small hand raised in a quiet studio, pointing at a sound everyone else missed. The silence after that playback did not feel empty. It felt heavy, charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. No one rushed to speak, because everyone in that room understood something irreversible had just happened. You don't unhear a truth once it's revealed to you. And for the first time, the adults in that studio were no longer guiding the child. They were following him. Michael didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or look around for approval. He simply stood there, listening again, already focused on what could be better. That, more than anything, unsettled the room. This wasn't a child enjoying a small victory. This was a musician unsatisfied until the sound matched what lived inside his head. From that moment forward, the rules changed quietly. No announcement was made. No apology was offered. But when Michael raised his hand again later that day, the tape stopped instantly. Word spread fast in ways studios always do, through whispers, raised eyebrows, late-night conversations between engineers who had never been challenged by someone so young. A 6-year-old who heard phase problems without touching a console. A child who felt timing errors before the click track revealed them. People laughed when they repeated the story, but the laughter carried nervous respect. Because if this was true, if a child could hear what trained professionals missed, then maybe the industry had been listening wrong all along. As sessions continued over the following weeks, Michael became something unusual, not just a performer but a reference point. Engineers began asking, "How does it feel to you?" Producers leaned closer when he spoke. The studio shifted from command to collaboration. Michael didn't know he was changing history. He only knew that sound had a shape, and when it bent the wrong way, it hurt. Years later, one engineer would describe it best. He said, "Most people listen with their ears. Michael listened with his whole body." That gift didn't come from training. It came from survival, from nights rehearsing until exhaustion blurred the room, from learning harmony before learning how to play, from being surrounded by sound so constantly that silence itself became loud. And this is where the story deepens. Because that flaw Michael heard wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. The industry was efficient, polished, confident, but it was also deaf to subtlety. It valued loud correctness over quiet truth. Michael's interruption wasn't disrespect. It was instinct protecting the soul of the music. As the years went on, This instinct became legendary. During the recording of later albums, Michael would stop sessions over things no one else noticed. A snare that landed a fraction too early, a background vocal that emotionally conflicted with the lyric, a reverb tail that felt lonely, as he once described it. Engineers learned to translate his language into technology. When Michael said something felt too sharp, it meant EQ. When he said something leaned forward, it meant timing. When he said a sound wasn't telling the truth, it meant start over. The seeds of all that power trace back to 1964. Back to a studio where a child was told to be silent. Back to 5 minutes that exposed a fundamental flaw, not just in sound, but in perception. Because the real mistake wasn't the misaligned track. The real mistake was assuming wisdom had an age limit. Michael Jackson grew up under relentless pressure, but this ability to hear what others couldn't became both his shield and his burden. It set him apart. It isolated him, and it demanded perfection from a world that rarely offered it back. Yet he never stopped listening. Not to critics, not to noise, only to the truth inside the sound. That's why his music feels alive decades later, because it was built by someone who refused to ignore discomfort, someone who trusted feeling over formula, someone who learned, at 6 years old, that silence in the face of wrongness is the greatest flaw of all. And maybe that's why this story still matters. Because somewhere right now, someone young is being told to wait their turn, to stay quiet, to trust the system, to ignore what they feel because it doesn't align with what's expected. But history remembers the ones who listened anyway. Michael Jackson didn't just stop a rehearsal that day. He stopped the illusion that expertise alone defines truth. He proved that the deepest intelligence often arrives as intuition. And he reminded the world that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one hearing everything. The night did not end when the session wrapped. Studios rarely sleep, and neither did the idea that had been planted in that room. Long after Michael was let out by an assistant, long after the reels were labeled and stacked, the engineers stayed behind. They replayed the tape again, not to check levels, but to understand what they had almost ignored. One of them muted the meters entirely. "No lights," he said, "just ears." That decision alone said everything. Because for the first time, they were trying to hear the way Michael Jackson heard. The flaw that night was small, but its implication was enormous. It exposed a quiet arrogance that had settled into the industry, the belief that technology had surpassed human sensitivity, that numbers could replace intuition, that experience could never be wrong. Michael shattered that belief without raising his voice. And from that fracture, something new began to grow. In the months that followed, producers started testing him, not maliciously, but curiously. They would play back mixes with intentional imperfections, watching his face instead of the console. Michael never failed. Sometimes he reacted before the sound even fully formed, as if anticipating where it would collapse emotionally. "He hears forward," one producer whispered once, "like he's already living inside the next second." That ability would later define his performances, the way he danced just ahead of the beat, the way his vocals leaned into silence, the way his pauses spoke louder than sound. It all traced back to listening. Listening is passive for most people. For Michael Jackson, it was active, physical, unavoidable. Sound moved him whether he wanted it to or not. He didn't process music, it processed him. And that made adulthood complicated. As Michael grew older, the same gift that made him extraordinary also made him restless. Perfection was not a goal, it was a baseline. Anything less felt like betrayal, not of ego, but of truth. During the recording of later projects, sessions would stretch for hours over details others begged him to ignore. A breath too long, a harmony too polite, a groove that felt safe instead of dangerous. "People will never notice," someone once told him. Michael shook his head. "They'll feel it." That sentence alone explains his legacy. Because audiences didn't analyze Michael Jackson, they responded to him. They didn't know why his music moved them differently. It just did. That difference was born in moments like the one in 1964, when a child trusted feeling over instruction. And here's the part most stories leave out. Michael was scared that day. Not of being wrong, but of being unheard. When he raised his hand, he didn't know if the room would listen or laugh. He only knew that letting the sound pass untouched would hurt more than embarrassment. That choice, risking rejection to protect truth, became the defining pattern of his life. Again and again, he chose discomfort over compromise. That choice reshaped pop music. From vocal layering to rhythmic structure, from emotional phrasing to cinematic silence, Michael Jackson forced the industry to confront something it had forgotten. Music is not measured, it's felt. And feeling requires vulnerability. The irony is cruel. The same sensitivity that allowed Michael to hear flaws no one else could also made him vulnerable to a world that was often too loud, too invasive, too careless with quiet souls. He absorbed everything: praise, criticism, noise, pain. But he never stopped listening. Even when the world shouted, he listened. Even when silence terrified him, he listened. Because listening was not something he did, it was who he was. That's why this story still echoes. Not because it's about a prodigy correcting adults, but because it's about courage. The courage to trust yourself when authority disagrees. The courage to speak when silence is expected. The courage to protect what's true, even when no one else hears it yet. Somewhere today, in a classroom, a rehearsal space, a bedroom with cheap speakers and a borrowed dream, there is someone hearing something others don't, feeling something that doesn't fit the rules, wondering if they should stay quiet. This story is for them. Because history doesn't move forward by consensus. It moves forward when someone interrupts. Michael Jackson interrupted a rehearsal. In doing so, he taught the world how to listen again. Years later, when people try to trace the origin of Michael Jackson's obsession with perfection, they often pointed to fame, pressure, or ambition. But the truth is quieter, deeper, and far more human. It began not with success, but with responsibility. The responsibility to protect sound from becoming careless. The responsibility to defend feeling from being flattened by routine. That responsibility was born in that studio. After 1964, Michael was never just the kid singer again. He became something else entirely, a listener first, a performer second. Before he sang a note, he absorbed the room, the air, the tempo of people's breathing. He noticed how engineers moved when they were confident and how they hesitated when something felt off. He learned to read uncertainty before it became audible. This is something no manual teaches. It's learned by paying attention when no one thinks you are. Michael watched everything. And as he watched, he learned that adults often confuse familiarity with correctness. They repeat what works until it stops working, then blame the audience when the magic fades. Michael never accepted that. To him, if something stopped moving the heart, it was broken, no matter how polished it sounded. This mindset followed him into every stage of his life. When he stepped onto larger stages, with brighter lights and louder crowds, the listening never stopped. He could hear the echo delay in massive arenas and adjust his timing instinctively. He could sense when a crowd's energy dipped seconds before it happened and pull them back with a pause, a look, a breath. People called it charisma. It was listening. Backstage before shows, Michael was often silent, not nervous, tuning in. He listened to the building hum, the distant voices, the subtle rhythm of anticipation. He once told a musician that every place had its own tempo, and if you didn't find it, the performance would fight you. That belief shaped everything. In rehearsals, he didn't just practice choreography. He practiced silence. He practiced stopping. He practiced waiting for the exact moment when movement felt inevitable instead of forced. That patience terrified people who worked on deadlines, but Michael refused to rush truth. Because he remembered what happened when sound was rushed. He remembered how close that session in 1964 came to being ruined, not by ignorance, but by assumption. And so he questioned everything. Why does the beat drop here? Why does this harmony resolve so soon? Why are we afraid of space? These weren't technical questions. They were emotional ones, and they made people uncomfortable because they didn't have easy answers. Some collaborators loved this, others couldn't stand it. But no one ignored it. As technology evolved, Michael stayed ahead not because he chased machines, but because he chased feeling. He embraced new tools only when they served emotion. When they didn't, he discarded them without hesitation. Digital clarity meant nothing to him if it erased warmth. Precision meant nothing if it killed groove. And groove to Michael was sacred. That sacredness came from childhood, from learning that one misaligned sound could poison an entire performance, from realizing that the smallest error, left unchallenged, grows quietly until it becomes the defining flaw. That's why he stopped sessions so often. Not because he was difficult, because he was honest. Honesty is expensive in creative spaces. It slows things down. It forces people to confront their own blind spots. It demands humility, and humility is rare where success is loud. Michael paid that price repeatedly. He was called obsessive. He was called unrealistic. He was called impossible. But decades later, those same recordings still breathe, still move, still listen back. That's not coincidence. It's consequence. The consequence of a child who refused to ignore discomfort. And here's the part that still stings for many professionals. Michael didn't need language to be right. He didn't need theory. He didn't need permission. He needed courage. Courage to stop a room. Courage to trust his ears when authority disagreed. Courage to be misunderstood. That courage didn't fade with age, it intensified. As the world grew louder, Michael listened harder. As expectations mounted, he slowed down. As criticism sharpened, he went inward. He protected the one thing that made him dangerous in the best way, his sensitivity. Sensitivity is often mistaken for weakness. Michael proved it was power. Power to hear truth before it becomes obvious. Power to feel imbalance before it becomes failure. Power to reshape an industry without ever declaring war. All because of one moment. One raised hand. One interruption. One flaw that everyone else missed. If that moment had gone differently, if the engineer had laughed louder, if the producer had dismissed him more firmly, if the tape had rolled on without pause, music history would sound different today. That's the terrifying beauty of listening. Everything depends on it. So when you hear Michael Jackson, remember this. Behind every perfect note is a refusal to accept good enough. Behind every iconic silence is someone who learned, at 6 years old, that silence can be louder than sound when it carries truth. And behind every movement that changed the world is a child who once pointed at a speaker and said, "It's wrong." What few people understand is that moments like this don't fade with time. They crystallize. They become internal reference points, silent memories that guide every decision afterward. For Michael Jackson, that studio interruption didn't become a story he told. It became a compass he followed. As adolescence arrived, the world began to speak louder to him. Expectations sharpened, schedules tightened, voices multiplied. But underneath the noise, Michael was still listening for the same thing he had heard at 6 years old: alignment. When sound, emotion, and intention locked together, he felt peace. When they didn't, he felt unrest. That unrest became his signal. By the late 1960s, studios were no longer places of novelty for him. They were workplaces, demanding ones. And yet, he never lost the habit of questioning what others rushed past. Engineers would notice him drifting closer to speakers, tilting his head, eyes half closed, as if listening behind the sound instead of to it. He was hearing relationships, how instruments interacted, how silence framed emotion, how timing carried meaning beyond tempo. Most people hear music as a line. Michael heard it as a space. That spatial awareness shaped his vocals. He didn't just sing notes, he placed them. He understood where a phrase needed room and where it needed pressure. He knew when to pull back so the listener could lean in. This wasn't taught, it was sensed. And every time someone tried to override that instinct, his mind returned to that first interruption, to the feeling of knowing something was wrong, while everyone else said it was fine. He learned an early lesson many never learn at all. Consensus is not truth. As his career expanded, so did the stakes. Budgets ballooned, teams grew, the margin for mistakes shrank. Ironically, this made listening even harder for those around him. When time costs money, subtlety becomes inconvenient. Michael never accepted that trade. There are stories, rarely told publicly, of sessions where dozens of people waited while he replayed a single bar over and over. Not to fix pitch, not to fix rhythm, but to fix intention. "What is this part saying?" he would ask. Silence followed, because that question doesn't have a fader. It demands awareness. That awareness frightened people who relied on procedure, but it energized those who understood art as something alive. Those collaborators would later say working with Michael Jackson felt like standing next to a tuning fork for emotion. If something was off, you felt it vibrate through the room. This sensitivity didn't switch off when the tape stopped. In conversations, Michael noticed pauses others ignored. In relationships, he sensed tension before words formed. In crowds, he felt emotional shifts like weather changes. Listening shaped not just his music, but his perception of the world. And this is where the story becomes bittersweet, because listening so deeply comes with a cost. The same openness that allowed Michael to hear microscopic flaws also made him absorb pain intensely. Criticism didn't bounce off, it echoed. Misunderstanding didn't fade, it lingered. The world wasn't designed for someone who listened that closely. But he never closed himself off. He couldn't. Listening was his language. That's why his music carries such emotional precision. It doesn't shout. It doesn't explain. It communicates through feeling, through space, through tension and release. It invites the listener into the same act of attention that defined him. When you hear a breath in his vocals, it's intentional. When you feel a pause stretch longer than expected, it's deliberate. When a groove locks so tightly it feels inevitable, it's the result of relentless listening. All of it traces back to that first realization. Sound tells the truth when people don't rush it. The industry eventually learned to adapt, not fully but enough. Engineers became more cautious. Producers became more curious. The idea that the kid might hear something turned into a quiet rule. And while many tried to replicate Michael's results with technology, they missed the point. It wasn't about equipment, it was about attention. You can buy better tools. You can't buy listening. That's earned. Earned through patience, through humility, through the willingness to stop everything when something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why yet. That willingness is rare. It was rare in 1964. It's rare now. And that's why this story still matters. Because it reminds us that progress doesn't always come from doing more. Sometimes it comes from stopping. Stopping the tape. Stopping the noise. Stopping the assumption that we already know enough. A 6-year-old Michael Jackson did that once. And in doing so, he left behind a blueprint, not just for music but for creativity itself. Listen first. Trust what you feel. Speak when it matters. And never ignore the quiet voice that tells you something isn't right. The story does not end with understanding. Understanding is only the doorway. What follows is consequence. As the years unfolded, Michael Jackson carried that early lesson like a hidden instrument, always tuned, always vibrating beneath the surface of his work. Every studio he entered afterward became a test, not of skill, but of awareness. Could the room listen? Could the people inside it slow down enough to hear what mattered? Often the answer was no. And when the answer was no, Michael adjusted himself instead of the room. He learned how to communicate through gesture, through repetition, through silence. When words failed, he let discomfort do the talking. He would replay a section until the impatience in the room grew loud enough to expose the truth. Because impatience is the enemy of listening. By the early 1970s, Michael was no longer a curiosity. He was a force. Yet even then, surrounded by accolades and expectations, he still felt like the smallest voice in the room, not because he lacked authority, but because authority rarely listens to itself. In meetings, executives talked numbers. Michael talked feeling. In planning sessions, teams talked strategy. Michael talked timing. In discussions about trends, Michael talked timelessness. These differences created friction, but friction creates heat, and heat, when controlled, creates energy. That energy powered some of the most influential recordings in modern history. But behind every triumph was resistance. People often assume genius is welcomed. It is. It disrupts. It exposes shortcuts. It makes comfort uncomfortable. Michael's insistence on listening forced others to confront their own inattentiveness. Some rose to the challenge, others resented it. And that resentment followed him. As his control over his music increased, so did the scrutiny. Every pause became suspicious. Every delay became exaggerated. Every perfectionist instinct was framed as excess. The same industry that once ignored his ears now criticized his standards. But Michael never lowered them. Because once you hear the truth, you can't pretend you don't. That truth guided him even when isolation grew, even when trust eroded, even when the world misunderstood his silence as strangeness rather than protection. Silence was where he listened best. It's important to understand this. Michael wasn't chasing flawlessness. He was chasing alignment. The moment when sound, movement, emotion, and intention all pointed in the same direction, when nothing fought itself. That's why his work feels inevitable. Not perfect, inevitable. Like it couldn't have existed any other way. That inevitability began with refusal. Refusal to accept a sound that felt wrong. Refusal to stay quiet when silence would betray the music. And that refusal carried a cost. Listening deeply means you hear everything, including what hurts. Michael heard disappointment before it was spoken. He heard insincerity in applause. He heard pressure disguised as praise, and he carried those sounds with him. Yet he never hardened. Instead, he poured that sensitivity into his art. When people danced to his music, they were responding to something honest, something unfiltered, something crafted by someone who refused to numb himself to noise. The tragedy is not that Michael listened too much. The tragedy is that the world listened too little to him. Still, his work remains. And it remains because it was built on listening, not spectacle. On patience, not haste. On courage, not compliance. That is why the story of a 6-year-old stopping a rehearsal matters more than any headline, because it reveals the origin of a philosophy, a way of moving through the world that values attention above ego. Attention is an act of respect. Michael respected sound enough to stop it. He respected feeling enough to wait. He respected truth enough to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. And through that respect, he changed music forever. So when you hear his voice today, through old speakers, new remasters, distant memories, listen closely. Not just to the notes, but to the space between them, to the pauses, to the breath. That's where the 6-year-old still lives. Still listening. Still stopping the world when something feels wrong. Still reminding us that the most powerful thing you can do is pay attention. And if this story continues to resonate with you, if it makes you want to listen more carefully, to music, to people, to yourself, then show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this story so it doesn't fade into background noise.